Hi, and welcome to the channel. So today we're going to be taking a look at part 2 of a breakdown of the Shaun of the Dead piece I posted to the channel about a week ago. In this particular phase, we're going to be working on the color rendering, starting with where we left off in part 1. In part 1, we got to this phase where we finished up our final line work, and now we're going to take that line work and move into the coloring phase. Now, before we get started, just understand here that the line work that we started with is broken down into a couple different layers and all on its own. So the character on the right, Shaun, is on his own layer. The character Ed on the left has his own layer, and then the background on a third layer behind that. The first step I work on from here is just getting some coloring in to separate these layers a little bit more. This coloring that I'm doing here, frankly, the color doesn't matter. It's just something to kind of separate one element from the other. So Shaun's going to be blue, but I want a nice bold color on Ed or Nick Frost on the left there to separate the two of them. So again, the color doesn't matter. It was just something that was completely different than the blue that I used for Shaun. And then once I get those separated out, that I'll work on truly rendering the background first and then coming up into these foreground layers where the characters are. Now, why these big bold colors? Well, I'm going to use these layers as a reference for when I add in my true color, light, and shadow a little bit later. I'll break down the method a little bit more when we get there, but that's kind of the mentality of it right now. I just want separation between characters and background. I'm going to start by rendering the background, and I want to make this as simple as possible just because I don't want to really spend time on this. I want to spend time on the characters. So what I start with is duplicating the line work for the background, and then using the bottom layer of those two to put in the colors. And the way that the colors go in is nice and quick because it's just quick fills using the line work to kind of trap whatever it is I'm filling in. So color goes in really, really quickly for that kind of shed that sits there. And then lines are used, thick lines are used to render the shadow and the light on that shed. So a thick kind of grayish line to kind of represent shadow and a thick kind of yellowish line to represent light. And then I just went and found some random texture brush to scrub in something of a dirt, aged, weathered type effect onto the front of it. Again, I'm not really all that worried about how perfect this is because it's just background and it's not really meant to kind of draw focus or attention. Now the next thing I'm doing here is another texture brush. This is something of like a leafy kind of shrubbish type brush, and it came from the Procreate software. I really don't work with brushes that are like, you know, special custom brushes or anything like that. And it's not that they aren't useful, it's just that I don't put a lot of stock in this idea that a brush is going to save my drawing somehow. So I kind of like just try to work with the tools that have been given, and I use that kind of textured brush to kind of render some shadow of the leaf work there, and then lightened up the color into a dark green, put in another layer of it, and then another kind of lighter green on top of that. And the intent here is to kind of create the shadow underneath, you know, bushes and shrubbery, and then build the lighter source of those leaves kind of on top of it and give it that bushy kind of three-dimensional texture-ish feel. Again, is it perfect? No, but it doesn't have to be. It's just going to sit in the background, and in the end, just to kind of pull this off a little bit more, I'm going to blur it just slightly to help it sit in that background and separate it from the foreground of the two characters that I'm trying to render. So really, I'm just kind of dumping in color, and wherever I can, I'm going to try to add a little bit of texture as well. So a lot of this stuff is just big, bold fills to get color in, but there are other areas where I just introduced a little bit of texture just to give it just a little bit of interest. Nothing that was just overwhelmingly, again, complex or anything like that, just something simple. Now, you may notice that over on the left-hand side of the piece, there's a small blue kind of oval or circle. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but for the right now, just understand that it's meant to be something of a palette. So somewhere I have a layer kind of separated off on its own where I put down colors that I want to kind of come back to and use later so I don't have to go hunting for them. Now, Procreate does a good job of kind of creating its own kind of palette for you, but sometimes I like to have it right on the piece of artwork so that way I can just kind of pull at it really, really quickly just by putting my finger on it, holding it down, or my stylus on it and holding it down for just a second to make that the color select. This particular blue is going to be important later on. That's why it's the only one sitting there right now. But it is a palette, again, that's going to be important to me. That particular blue I'm going to want for some shadow work later on. And I know that may not make a lot of sense right now, but this blue is going to be perfect for shadows later, and I'll explain how I use it to get those shadows when we get into the character rendering a little bit later. Now, right now, I'm just kind of tweaking everything in the background just to make sure that I have it kind of all set, because I don't want to come back and have to kind of redo anything later. So I'm working on the little blur effects. I'm working on kind of adjusting some of the colors in the layer to kind of achieve some sense of balance. I want the textured, weathered look to kind of stand out a little bit more, so I'm kind of increasing the saturation, and then put that little final just slight blur in to help it sit back in the background a little bit. Now that that's done, I'm working on my next layer up from there, which is going to be the character of Nick Frost, or Ed. Now, remember, I started with something of kind of like a peach color that covered the entire figure. And the reason that this is important is because I'm using that layer and locking it and making it a reference for all the layers that I build on top of it as I put in these flat colors and then later the shadow and the light. Now, the point of doing this is so that way I have that reference layer to kind of create a boundary as to where my colors can go and not fall off later. So think of it this way: if I have this layer that's maybe like a hot pink that just creates the outline or the silhouette of our character here, then I can use that silhouette as a reference and just throw other colors on top of it without having to kind of go over the lines. I don't have to worry about things that kind of overspray or overpaint and kind of get caught in the background, because if I'm using the initial silhouette layer as a reference and making masks above that, then everything will stay confined to the shape of that silhouette. So as I'm drawing in these shadows and stuff like that, I can go over the lines without having any worry about it, because the silhouette reference will make sure that it doesn't show on the final rendering. If you're experimenting with your masks and layers, there are some other tutorial videos out there that might help you understand this concept a little bit. It was a little bit heady for me and difficult for me to master at first, but really it's just a matter of getting some practice in and kind of nailing down the method of using masks and reference layers like that. And I think you'll find that'll make things really, really easy for you to try to get some of these renderings done, especially when you're trying to put in your shadows and your light. Now with Nick, I took a couple different approaches here when it came to the shadow, and what I mean by that is that I did something of a mixture of kind of hardline shadows and then soft edge shadows. You know, really I had a reference photo to go off of here for the most part, so this wasn't really a difficult thing to figure out, but there was some stuff that was kind of obvious from the get-go, like there should be big bold shadow without a whole lot of nuance underneath his arms and underneath where the spade or the shovel is. Same thing with the lower part of his arm that's in shadow. As you may be able to tell already, the light source is meant to come from kind of the upper left portion of the frame there, and so everything that's on the right side of his face is cast in shadow. And what you may have noticed is I put in that shadow really, really dark, and then all of a sudden it lightened up, and that's just because once I got done with, you know, putting the shadows where I wanted them, then I lowered the opacity to kind of make it a little bit more subtle. I didn't want really, really big, bold differences between shadow and light here. They're outside. We don't need that big kind of bold difference. There's not a huge light source shining directly on the top of his head, for instance. Now, we do have some light to render here as well, and this is a good idea to kind of work this way, at least for my own method. I put in a layer of shadow, and then right after that, a layer of light, and then once I have them both down, I can start deciding whether or not I need more light or more shadow to create a sense of balance. The thing about this is that if you're just putting in a shadow and then you don't, you know, come back to light and start putting in more shadow, you start making things out of balance. And what I mean by that is that sometimes your piece is going to get either too dark or too light, because you don't have the opposite end of the spectrum to try to offer you some balance and understand where your tonal values should be. Now, this happened really, really quickly, so you may have missed it, but one of the other things I did before I put in the shadow is that once I got the flesh tone in, I also painted in some red on the face. You may be able to see it already, but it went in pretty quickly, so you may have missed it initially when it went in. But there's some red put in on the top tips of the ears, the lips, and the tip of the nose. This is pretty typical of faces. We have blood vessels that kind of come close to the surface of the skin there. But on Nick Frost, especially in the ears, that red is very, very pronounced. And again, especially in the reference photo. So not only did I get the red in there, but I painted it in really loose and then kind of lowered the opacity until I was happy that it gave some warmth to the flesh, and also it was a little bit closer to the true skin tone that Nick has. Shadows are in, some subtle lights are in, and again, every time I put those things in, I adjust the opacity until I'm kind of happy with it, and then decide whether or not I want to add another layer to go a little bit further with this. Now, that's kind of the point, right? We have a layer that is just my silhouette, then I have a mask on top of it that's going to be my flat colors, then on top of that, shadow, on top of that, lights, and then potentially maybe another layer of shadow or another layer of lights if I feel that it's necessary for the piece. And then on top of all that, some sort of a highlight work if I need to kind of put something in there. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit later, is hair. So I'm going to leave that subject alone for just the time being. But I'd like to kind of point out here that as part of my line work, there's a big bold black that kind of encompasses the hair here. And when it comes to the line work again is in 2 layers. I have a layer kind of down in the bottom and then a layer on top, so that way I can put all my colors, but this big bold black lines always stay evident to me and I know where all my line work is. But that means that everything sits below a layer of black line work, and when it comes to hair, I'm going to need to put some color in there and it'll have to go above that bold line work. So when it comes time to get to the hair will get its own layer, and that layer will go above everything else because it has to sit on top of the ink work, so to speak. The same thing can also be said for the spade or the shovel, which is why I'm kind of saving that for last. I'll get to it a little bit later. Now right now I'm still just trying to enhance my light a little bit, and the point here is that I put in the shadow, I put in a layer of light, and now I'm kind of stepping back and just trying to get the full effect to see if I'm getting something that seems to be three-dimensional on the screen. It wasn't, so I went and pulled out a little bit more light to make it a little less subtle. And what I'm also doing is I'm trying to make sure that I get a little bit of texture in there and a little bit of variation of tone as well, kind of similar to what faces would do with light bouncing around and little muscles in the brow and so on and so forth. So what I'm doing is I'm putting down a layer of that light color with some sort of a textured brush. Again, it doesn't really matter which one, because what I'm doing afterwards is I'm kind of smudging the result. So there is something of a finger or a smudge tool in Procreate, and I use that to kind of blend everything out and give it a more soft, subtle look that I think kind of works for some of these facial features. Now I'm going in and I'm adding in the stubble. Again, from the reference photo, it was very obvious that the character here had some stubble, so it was necessary to kind of draw it in. I debated a couple different ways of doing this, but what I ultimately settled for is just putting in a layer of a kind of a grayish, not very saturated blue to give the effect of something of a 5 o'clock shadow, and then on another layer, going in and kind of scribbling in the individual little stubbles of the hair. So you can kind of see that going in right now. That is also a blue, but it's a desaturated dark gray and set to multiply. So that way you get that kind of dark stubbly look that kind of pops off the face there. Let's talk a little bit about shadow, because there is something of a trick that I use for this, and I have received not only a couple of compliments, but a couple of questions on how I do shadow, because I think what the mentality is that some people, when they're working in digital work, they treat this very much like paint, and that means mixing colors to kind of come up with a shadow color for the shirt, and then a shadow color for the flesh, and then a different shadow color for some other element that you're putting shade on, and et cetera, et cetera. And I really don't work that way. I'll be the first to admit I'm something of a lazy artist, so if I can find a trick that's effective and it works, I'm going to use it, and I did use it quite a bit in this piece. And it really has to do with that blue blob on the left-hand side of the piece that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So take a look at it. Over on the left-hand side of the piece, there is a blue kind of an oval there, and all it really is just a blue that I picked a little while ago at the very beginning of the piece when I was rendering the background. I took that blue and I made it its own layer, so that way it wasn't affected by anything on top of it, like a filter or a blend mode or anything like that. It just sits on its own layer, really kind of the top of the layer stack, and it just sits there and works as a palette that I can come back to and choose colors from a little bit later on. Now the reason this blue is important is because it's what I'm using for my shadows. So just a little bit of talk about color theory really quick before we kind of go on here. The characters, the setting, it's all outside. And so I have to consider that when I'm talking about my light source. My light source in this case is really nothing more than the sun, because we're outside. It's the strongest light source there is. And because we're outside and because we're using the sun as our light source, then we can assume that our light is a warm light, a yellowish, maybe even a little bit orangish warm light. If I'm working with a warm light, then I'm going to want a cool shadow to complement it. And that's what that blue is. That blue is a nice cool color that I'm going to be using for all my shadow work. Doesn't matter where my shadow's going. Flesh, shirt, shovel, background, doesn't matter. I'm using the same blue for all my shadow. Now let's talk about why that works a little bit. Again, the idea here is that I'm using it as a cool color that I'm going to use as my shadow, but it's not just going to be blue. that's kind of where the trick kind of gets pulled off. I'm using this blue with something of a blend mode on its own layer, and that's what's going to kind of pull off this trick. So here's how it works. Starting with the color, again, I know that I'm going with a cool color, but I don't have really the ability to kind of show you the color palette that I came from, but if you did go and kind of color pick this, go look at it a little bit later, what you'll notice is that it's a very light, very desaturated blue, meaning that it's really kind of more scaling to a gray, but there are definitely just a little bit of tones of blue in it. Once I have that color selected, again, I'm going to go into its own layer, and I'm going to set that layer to multiply. Once that layer is set to multiply, I can use that cool color and just paint in shadow everywhere, over every surface, and for whatever reason, it will work. And now, it's not really a whatever reason. Let me kind of go back and explain this a little bit. Multiply takes the colors that are beneath it on all the layers and adds that and kind of mixes it into this cool blue that we're using for our shadow work. So I don't really need to mix a bunch of different colors to get a different shadow for the shirt, a different shadow for the flesh. The blue on a multiply blend mode will pull those colors up and do that mix for me automatically in kind of a digital sense. And again, it's a cheat. I'll call it what it is. It's a great trick. It works pretty effectively, but it is a matter of making sure that you set that layer to a blend mode and getting a nice, cool, desaturated blue that kind of skews more to the gray more than anything else. Really, if you're looking at your kind of color square, if you're using the square version, it's really very, very far off to the left, and again, very, very light blue, almost gray. Once you get that multiply layer on there and you just paint this stuff in, I think you'll be surprised how well it works, although it may come off a little bold at first. Just like when we first started painting in Nick Frost's face here, it looked like a really, really dark, bold shadow that wasn't going to work or balance or blend. But now that we've kind of lowered the opacity a little bit, added in some of the light, you can see that it has in fact balanced out. And all I did on the shirt and the face and everything else was that blue color that you're seeing over there on the blob. This whole process is going to get repeated all over again when we get into the Shaun figure a little bit later on, but that's essentially the element of it. This is the big trick. It's just using a nice, cool, desaturated blue and then kind of painting it in. With some tricks about, you know, blending and making sure that you just make some decisions about hardline shadows or soft shadows. Now, soft shadows are important as well, so let's speak to that here really quick. The soft shadow that I have kind of draping over his shoulder there, the cast shadow from his head, has some boldness to it, but it also fades out and kind of has something of a soft edge. There are a couple different ways to pull off this effect, and you'll see that a lot of people will do this by selecting out an area with a select tool, kind of similar to what a lot of Photoshop artists do. They'll use a lasso tool to kind of create a boundary as to where they want their shadow to go, and they'll do something of like a gradient fill or an airbrush fill to kind of get this soft edge there. That works, and I've done it a couple different ways like that, and depending on what I'm drawing, that is a really, really effective method. But in this one particular example, I found it pretty effective just to kind of draw in the shadow the way I wanted it to, and then I used the smudge tool to just kind of blend out the edge there and give it a little bit of a softness to it. And the reason I did it this way is because it softened not only the line on the edge there, but also softened up quite a bit of the shadow until you had something kind of a little bit more thick and a little bit more saturated in the middle and a little lighter and desaturated kind of around the edges there. So it pulled off a better effect, mostly because if you look at the very, very edge of his shoulder, there is something of a reflected light there that kind of gets pulled off, a rim light, if you will, that kind of got pulled off because of the way that I went and softened the shadow to begin with. The shovel blade got rendered here really quick, so let me just speak to that briefly and talk about the method. The idea was, again, just to get some three-dimensionality out of it, so it kind of matched the rest of the piece there, but I struggled with it a little bit because I had rendered it in just this big, bold black square that was part of my ink and my line work. So what I had to do is create a layer above all the other layers and kind of just use some texture brushes to scratch in a bunch of different colors, almost as if this shovel had been weathered through years of use and being scraped and rusting a little bit and stuff like that. So I started by just assuming here that the black that I initially kind of colored the shovel blade was something of a paint job. And if we imagine that to be a paint job, then it's going to get scratched up, damaged, and once the paint scratches off, it'll rust a little bit. So I started by using some, random texture of like metal or something like that to punch in some grays there to kind of simulate the scratching, and then put some orange and some red and some other rust colors on top of that sparingly to try to get that effect that there is a little bit of a weathered, again, rust look to it. This isn't completely done yet. I want to add something of an edge to it to give it a certain sense of three-dimensionality or thickness. Other than that, I'll kind of call it done from that point. This is another thing that I didn't want to over-render or spend a lot of time on because it's not the focal point of the piece. So if I do too much to it, it might draw the eye. That's not what I'm trying to do. I want eyes drawn to the faces. That's the whole point. So you may also notice here that I'm kind of putting in some more shadows here. I'm kind of deciding where they go as I go along. And at some point I kind of figured out that I forgot to put in a shadow to pull that shovel forward and push his shoulder back. We're getting it in here now, but you may notice that this is a darker shadow. So in this particular case, and I don't do this every time, but in this particular case, I thought it necessary to create a shadow layer, a light layer, and then a second shadow layer to get the deep dark shades that I'm looking for here. Same method as before. I'm just going to kind of draw it in here. And, methods may vary on this. There's some people that may say that I'm doing this wrong, and with a few additional clipping masks, I'd be able to paint in these shadows a little bit cleaner. I've experimented with a lot of different methods, and this is just something that works for me and for this particular piece. If I was doing something slightly different, I might use more like, kind of mask filters and mask layers and so on and so forth. But the way that I kind of rendered this one kind of worked out, and I'll kind of do a mix of different methods and different tricks depending on what I'm working on, and what the problem solving technique really is more than anything else. So I painted in some shadow there, but I did overpaint into the handle of the shovel. I just went back in with the erase tool and kind of took it out of there. It just, to me, seemed faster than going through the laborious building layers and select tools and so on and so forth. It was just a lot quicker to pull out an eraser when I was done. Now that I feel like I'm relatively happy with Nick, it's time to move on to Shaun. And you'll see basically we're going to repeat the method. So I have the silhouette, and I'm using this silhouette to build a series of layers that are referenced back to that initial silhouette. So we'll start by painting in the flesh tones in the face and in the arms. And when I did this, one of the things that might be necessary to point out is that I tried to make sure that the flesh tone that I rendered for Shaun was at very least slightly different than the flesh tone for Nick. So what I started with was by doing a color pick off of the flesh that I finished up for Nick. And once I had that in the color picker, I changed it slightly. I made it a little more yellow and then used that as the base flat for what we used for Shaun. Now, it may look a little bit light, it may look a little bit pasty, but it doesn't matter because we're going to be tweaking this quite a bit as we go along. We'll speak to it as we get there, but for right now, let's finish up the flats. So, this was easy when it came to the color picking because Shaun wears a very distinct, I may call it a costume in the movie. The cricket bat is obviously brown, the shirt's going to be white, and the tie is going to be red. Then we're going to put in the hair. Now the hair is coming in a little bit dark than it is in the movie, but this gets back to this idea that I want to be layering hair on top of other hair, much like I did with Nick. So much with like I did with Nick, I started with black and built some browns and some lighter tones up above it with some brush strokes. I'm going to do something similar with Shaun, where I'm starting with a darker orange because I'm going to use this almost like a shadow to build lighter colors of yellow on top of to give that illusion of a thickness to his hair. Now, a word about white for just a second, and white specifically to Shaun's shirt. I can say the same thing for black, too. White and black, pure white, pure black, are very much opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to color theory, and they're very rarely used in a finished piece. You'll very rarely see a pure white or a pure black. Now, you are seeing pure black in my stuff, but it's only in the line work, and it's because of the kind of comic book style I'm trying to emulate a little bit. So we'll kind of forgive that, but when we're talking about like shadow, there's very rarely pure black. That's why I'm using that blue method that I talked about a little bit earlier. White is also very, very rarely used, unless we're talking about just a single highlight on an eye or something like that. So the shirt that we're going to be coloring in here, you'll notice is not white. It is more like a bluish gray. And again, it may seem like it's a little bit dark right now, but understand that this is meant to be the mid-tone. The flats here are meant to be kind of the middle tone or the middle value that you're trying to achieve. And you're going to be going darker than that middle tone with shadow and lighter than that middle tone with your lights when you add them all in a little bit later. So a general rule of thumb as you're kind of rendering and putting in your flats, at least for me, is that whatever color I think I want to put in, I try to go a couple values or a couple shades darker than that, knowing that I'm going to be coming in with lights and shadows a little bit later. So now we're going to be starting in on the shadow work on Shaun's face, and this is no different than what I did with Nick. I went back to my palette where I have my blue blob, I selected it, put a layer on top of my flats, and then set it to multiply mode. Now notice what this is. It's very much a kind of a grayish blue that's being painted over the flesh here, and right now it looks ugly. But remember, it's not the final product. I'm just trying to get the shadows in, get my blends where I want them, and eventually I'll lower opacity and add light to balance things out. So don't be afraid to go in big and bold, because even after it's all said and done, you can go back and make tweaks and adjustments to it later, assuming that your shadows are on their own separate layer. And that's why I do it like this, because if my shadows are on their own separate layer, I don't have to worry about how dark or light or how desaturated or unsaturated it is. I can go tweak all that later once I've got all my elements in and I decide I want to create balance later. Now there's a couple different ways to do that too. You could wait until the whole thing's said and done and then go into each individual layer and you can tweak things like the hue and the saturation and etc. But there's another way to do this we'll talk about a little bit later, so kind of bear with me, keep watching, and we'll get to it. Now right now I'm adding in the red into Shaun's face, and I think this might be an important thing to point out as well. Anytime I'm rendering a face, all faces always have an element of red that I add in. It's, again, another one of those little tricks that help you render flesh tones. So you notice it very, very clearly in Nick's face because it was very much a part of the photograph. The sun was shining behind his ears or something, and that red kind of really came through. But Shaun has something of a red complexion to him as well, and really just about anybody does. Because we have blood vessels in our face that rise very close to the surface in our nose and ears, even with darker flesh, like African Americans and stuff like that, there is an element of red to their flesh. So don't make the mistake of just painting in one tone and saying, that's it, I'm done with the face. These little blobs of red, blurred, blended, and then faded, really make a big difference. They add a little warmth to the figure and give it something of a more realistic look. Now, what I'm doing at this point is I've started adding in the light source, and I'm going back and adding in more shadow. So light is on its own layer, shadow is on its own layer, and again, this is just applying to Shaun. Shaun has his own shadows, Shaun has his own lights, Nick has his own shadow layer, Nick has his own light layer, and that way I can kind of go back and forth and try to achieve the balance to not only bring a three-dimensionality out of the figure, but also to make sure that I'm maintaining the resemblance. So for example, we talked a little bit earlier about Shaun and these very, very sharp lines that kind of make up the cheekbones. It was really, really important to make sure that shadow and light were rendered properly there, because if they weren't in the right place, then you are not going to have a figure that looks anything remotely like Simon Pegg or Shaun. So what I did here is I painted in a little bit of shadow, painted in a little bit of light, and now I'm kind of going back and forth until I achieve the effect that I'm looking for, and then occasionally stepping away from my desk or stepping away from the tablet to walk across the room and looking at it from afar to make sure that I'm capturing that resemblance. And at all times, I have a computer screen next to me with the reference photo to look back and forth and see where the difference is. Once I see a difference, I go back and try to make the two look a little bit more similar, at least as best you can with a caricature. Again, the shadows are going in pretty dark here. I'm not worried about it though. I know it's all going to balance out at the end. And that's really what it kind of comes down to, is working in this mentality long enough that you start to get confident with making bold moves like this, knowing that you know, you can kind of do some tweaks later on. If you ask me, this is really one of the biggest benefits of having this ability to work in a digital medium. Number one, layers are important. I love my layers, and I love that ability to kind of stack things on top of each other, but that ability to manipulate that layer, to tweak it, to change the hue, to change the saturation, or even, if all else fails, just to delete it and start over, makes you very, very brave when it comes to doing some of this work. And sometimes some of the biggest accidents turn into those really, really good things that are the best part of your piece. As Bob Ross said, happy accidents, right? You can experiment without fear of ruining the piece. And sometimes those experiments, you know, bear some really, really ripe fruit. Now, I'm focusing on the face here before I do anything else, because I've at this point finished up Nick. I'm pretty happy with the resemblance, and I want to make sure that I can achieve the same with Shaun before I spend a lot of time working on shirt and cricket bat and arms and so on and so forth. So this is where I'm really kind of going to spend a lot of time making sure that I tweak and get all the details right. The other thing that might bear mentioning here as well is that, you know, I'm not happy with the line work. I like the way it looks, but I don't want these bold black lines to stay here forever. So eventually I'm going to go in and start changing the color of some of these lines just to make sure that it blends a little bit more with the piece and creates, I think, a more interesting effect. Now, coloring over your line work can be a difficult little thing unless, again, you use a little trick for it. And here's how this works. All my line work is separated, as I mentioned before, on 3 layers. I have the background layer on its own line work. Excuse me, the background line work on its own layer. I have Nick's line work on its own layer, and I have Shaun's line work on its own layer. And then each of those layers of line work has been duplicated, so I can use one for coloring and one that just kind of sit on top of everything else and be kind of an untouched version of that line work, so that way I don't cover it up by accident while I'm doing my rendering. At some point, though, I'm going to change the color of this line work, and the way that I'm going to do that is to take that line work that sits on the top of everything, and I'm going to do a auto lock on it. Now, the auto lock basically just is a layer mode that allows you to take whatever exists on that layer, in this case that inked work, and lock it in place so it can't be changed. And what I mean by can't be changed is that you can't add new line work to it, and you can't erase any either. And that's important because the auto lock makes sure that everything stays in place, but it does allow you to change the color. And that's the beauty of it. The pixels cannot be changed, but the color of the pixels can. So later when I want to go in and change the color of the line work, I just keep it in auto lock mode, and I can paint right over top of it with whatever color I want, and the pixels won't change, but the color of those pixels will. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into it. For right now, I think you may have noticed here that the shirt got rendered, and it was actually a really simple render. The color of the shirt was already pretty dark because Shaun is slightly turned away from the light. So I didn't really have to do much in terms of putting in shadow on this. I mostly just needed to put in the light to get that sense of his body turning away from the light source. So rather than going in with big dark shadows first, I started with the light. Once I got that in, I realized there wasn't going to be a lot of shadow needed. I just, you know, put a little bit of enhancements underneath the hands where the cricket bat is, and also on the tie. But for the most part, you won't see much other shadow other than that. The chest of Shaun there, for the most part, the mid-tone is going to satisfy the need for the shadow there. Okay, again, same method though. I'd like to just make sure that I'm reminding you here that I used a particular color, that blue, as the shadow on the face, but that same blue was pulled right back up again when I started doing the shadow on the shirt, the tie, and etc. So it's the same blue across everything, but because the layer of the shadow is set to multiply, it's pulling up red from the tie in order to create that reddish shadow color for the tie. It's pulling up that flesh tone to get the shadow for the flesh, and the same thing with the tone and the color and the value of the shirt as well. I find this to be a really handy method. I've actually been using this for quite a bit, and because I think it's so effective, I really don't use many other methods to render shadow, other than one other thing. Bear in mind here again, the reason I'm using blue, a cool color for my shadow, is because I have a warm light source. There are going to be times where you need to switch that up a little bit, and you'll see this a lot in movies. John Wick, as a matter of fact, is a really good example of this. John Wick takes place quite a bit in a lot of dark settings, and so the light source is either lights from the city, like some sort of a fluorescent light, or potentially moonlight if he's outside. And these lights are, generally speaking, cool colors, blue and purples and so on and so forth. So when you're drawing and you have a light source that is a cool color, again, you want to go opposite with your shadows, and that means a warm a warm color for your shadows. Go with the opposite, and that usually works. So if you have a blue light source, it might be tempting to go red for your shadows in terms of a warm color, but I tend to go with the opposite of blue, which is more like a orange. I find that orange and blue light source versus shadow are really, really effective in creating balance. And again, you'll see a lot of examples of this in comic books and in movies that are meant to kind of emulate lighting from comic books. Go back to those Marvel movies. You will see a lot of blue and orange contrasts going on between light and shadow that really kind of create some really interesting effects. And that color theory of working in opposite colors can really also help you pull off a couple of other tricks that we'll talk about a little bit later as well. So as we go through here a little bit, we're just kind of working on some touch-up work as we go along. So the shadow, you may have noticed, has been layered onto the cricket bat along with its light source to give it that kind of curved texture to it. A little bit later on, I'm also going to go in on a second layer that's also set to multiply as if I'm putting in shadow, and I'm going to just change the color slightly. I'm going to go with a more kind of darker grayish blue and use, again, multiply mode to kind of sketch in or kind of paint in some texture to mimic the wood grain that's on that cricket bat. Now, it's kind of funny how this worked. This is another example of one of those happy accents that I was mentioning a little bit earlier. I knew that I wanted to get some texture into the cricket bat. I knew that it's made out of wood, so I'm probably looking for some sort of a wood grain type texture. The question is how to do it, how to pull it off. I wasn't quite sure. So when you see it get painted in, it's going to go in really quick, and that's why I'm going to talk about it right now. It's really just a matter of, again, getting that blend mode into a multiply mode with a darker kind of grayish blue, and then all I really did was just get some sort of a kind of a dry brush, just like you see right now, paint it in, and then I'm going to blur it a little bit. And that little bit of a blur gives you that effect of that wood grain that's in the cricket bat there. That's it. Pretty simple, right? And again, it was just one of those little happy accents. I wasn't sure that was going to work. I was actually prepared to erase this and try something else, but I was pretty happy with the effect once I got the blur in there. I kind of smudged it a little bit more just to kind of get a little bit more of that effect and you know, kind of lighten it up the effect a little bit so it wasn't too eye-catching. And there we go. We have a fully rendered cricket bat, and I can move on to the next portion of the piece. Now, I did this a couple of weeks ago, so as we're going through here, I'm probably going to finish up. Yeah, we're going to come up on the filter right now. So watch what happens here. You're going to see something flash on the screen, and once you do, I'll explain exactly what happened. There we go. And there we go. Okay, so you saw a blue flash and then an orange flash or pinkish flash. And let's explain exactly what happened. This gets back to that color theory I was mentioning a little bit earlier, where I'm trying to create an opposite effect between blue and orange. The blue went in the background, and all it was just a blue layer that I applied to everything in the background behind the two characters, and then I just lightened the opacity and did something similar to the foreground. My two characters are in the foreground, so I put an orange layer over them, cut out anything that applied to the background, so that orange is only on top of the two figures, and then from there, again, lower the opacity to about 10%. The point here is that this helps balance everything out. All my foreground characters have a similar set of colors applied to them because they have this kind of orange filter over top of it, and the same thing was done with the background with a blue filter on it. It does a couple different things. It creates kind of a unity of color, but in addition, I have blue in the background and orange in the foreground, so that contrast helps the three-dimensionality. It pushes the background back, pulls the foreground forward, and you achieve this kind of effect of depth. Again, it's just a little trick, and it's one of those really great steps to kind of throw in at the end there just to kind of achieve that final effect that you're looking for. Now, the whole thing got finished up here by coloring the line work, as I mentioned before, which is what's happening right now, and putting in the word balloon with the little punchline there. So if you had seen the original version of this video, this was published as one of my kind of Sunday funnies thing that didn't have any narration to it. It was just kind of a little joke where you see the drawing happen and the punchline would kind of come in at the end. But once I got that punchline at the end, I decided to do a final couple tweaks in the line work because, as I mentioned before, I just wanted to kind of get some coloring in there, mess with the hair a little bit, tweak a couple little things, just kind of finish this whole thing up. But the joke is there, the punchline's there, and hopefully it was something that gave you a little bit of a chuckle in these kind of trying times. This is going to finish up the second video then, and obviously finishing up the piece as well. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions about anything I did in the rendering method, feel free to leave a comment in the comments section. And of course, please share and subscribe. The subscriptions really help me out, and I hope that you come back soon to see more of these videos. If you'd like to see more of these tutorials, let me know, and I'll be posting more soon. Thank you.